The date is November 14th, 2025. Somewhere inside the private apartments of Windsor Castle, behind doors that have not opened to outsiders in nearly 2 years, a meeting is taking place that no press release will ever describe. King Charles is seated. His hands are folded. And across from him, standing where a monarch would normally stand, is his sister, Princess Anne. And what she is about to say, on his behalf, will freeze Prince William and Prince Harry in place for the rest of their lives. What if I told you that the man who fought his entire life to wear the crown just handed his voice to someone else? What if I told you that the King of England, in what those close to him are calling the most vulnerable moment of his reign, could not bring himself to say the words out loud and ask the one person in that family he has always trusted more than any wife, any son, any advisor, to say them for him? By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what Princess Anne delivered inside that room. Why Charles chose her over Camilla, over William, over every courtier in that palace, and why both of his sons walked out of Windsor that afternoon looking like men who had just heard a sentence they could never unhear. Before we go any further, hit subscribe, because this story does not end where you think it ends, and what unfolds in the next few minutes will change the way you look at this family forever. Let's rewind, because to understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what Windsor looked like in the days before it happened. Charles had been unwell for longer than the palace ever admitted. The cancer diagnosis of February 2024 had never truly gone away. It had gone quiet. And then it had come back. And then it had gone quiet again. In a rhythm his doctors described privately as unpredictable. He had continued to work. He had continued to smile through investitures and garden parties. But those who saw him up close, the valets, the private secretaries, the small handful of family members allowed near him at Highgrove, all noticed the same thing. He was tired in a way that no rest could fix. And then came the summons. It went out on a Thursday evening. No official invitation, no printed itinerary, just a phone call made by his private secretary to each senior member of the family. Come to Windsor. Come Saturday. Come alone. William received his call while at Adelaide Cottage with Kate. Anne received hers while riding at Gatcombe Park. Edward and Sophie were told over dinner at Bagshot Park. And Harry received his in California, 7,000 miles from home, at a time when most of his family had stopped calling him at all. That last detail matters, because it tells you something about the weight of what was coming. Charles did not have to include Harry. He could have kept this in-house, kept it neat, kept it British. But he didn't. He picked up the phone himself, according to those familiar with the arrangements, and he asked his younger son to fly home. Alone, without Meghan, without the children, just Harry. And Harry came. He landed at Heathrow on the Friday, took an unmarked car straight to Windsor, and checked into Frogmore Cottage for what staff later described as the quietest night any of them could remember. He did not eat much. He did not make phone calls. He sat by a window, one aide said, for nearly 2 hours, watching the light drain out of the sky. By Saturday morning, the entire family was assembled. Camilla was there. William was there. Kate was there, and this is worth pausing on, because Kate has not been a regular presence at these kinds of gatherings since her own health scare in 2024. Her being in that room tells you the palace understood the magnitude of the meeting. Edward and Sophie were there. Anne was there. And Charles. But here's the thing. Charles never spoke. He greeted his family, one by one. He held William's hand. He kissed Kate on the cheek. He looked at Harry for a long moment, a very long moment, according to one witness who spoke to a royal correspondent in the days that followed, and he squeezed his younger son's shoulder without a single word. Then he sat down, and he nodded at his sister. And Anne began to speak. Now ask yourself something. When have you ever in your lifetime seen a reigning British monarch deputize his own voice to someone else in front of his own children? Not for a state function, not for a diplomatic dinner, for his final wish. for the words that would define what remains of his reign and everything that comes after it. You haven't. Because it has never happened. Not like this. Anne stood by the window. She did not use notes. She did not raise her voice. Those who know Anne in Britain has watched this woman for more than 70 years now will tell you that she does not perform emotion. She does not perform anything. She is the least theatrical person in that entire family, which is precisely insiders now believe why Charles chose her. Because what he was about to say could not be dressed up. It could not be softened. It could not be spun. He wants me to tell you, Anne began, according to accounts that have since made their way out of Windsor through channels no palace can fully seal, that he has made his decisions, and that he needs you to hear them from someone who will not flinch. William, standing near the fireplace, did not move. Harry, seated in an armchair across the room, looked down at the floor. Camilla, according to one description, went very still. And Anne kept going. She told them, first, that Charles had accepted the reality of his condition, not in a dramatic way, not with self-pity, but with the kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement that only someone who has spent 76 years being watched can produce. She told them that he intended to continue working for as long as his doctors allowed, but that he was no longer under the illusion that as long as possible meant many more years. And then she told them the wish. But before we get to what that wish actually was, and trust me, when you hear it, you will understand why William stopped breathing for a moment, and why Harry's eyes filled with tears he did not bother to hide. We need to talk about why this room, this configuration, this moment was engineered so carefully. Because nothing in that palace happens by accident. Charles has spent decades studying the failures of monarchs before him. He watched his mother navigate the annus horribilis of 1992. He watched his grandfather George VI die too young, leaving a daughter unprepared. He watched his great-uncle Edward VIII abdicate in a scandal that nearly broke the institution. And he learned, more than anything else, that when a monarch does not put his wishes in order, other people put them in order for him. Charles was not going to let that happen. Not to William, not to Harry, not even to Camilla. And so, in the months before this meeting, according to those monitoring the family's internal dynamics, Charles had been quietly drafting. Not a will. That already exists, and has existed since long before his accession. Something else. A private letter of intent. A document, insiders describe, that outlines not just financial arrangements but relational ones. Who is to be forgiven? Who is to be reconciled with? Who is to be given a second chance? And who, if the king has his way, is to be brought back into the fold before it is too late. And the person at the very center of that document, according to what Anne revealed in that room, was Harry. If you've made it this far into this story, hit like, because what comes next is the part the palace never wanted you to hear, and it is the part that explains everything about the last 5 years of this family's public silence. Anne turned, at that point in her delivery, to face Harry directly. And she said, quietly, that their father wanted him home. Not as a working royal, not with titles restored, not with security reinstated by royal decree, but as a son, as a brother, as a member of a family that had, in Charles's own words relayed through his sister, spent too many years pretending that distance was the same thing as peace. Think about that for a moment. This is a king who has been advised, for years, by some of the sharpest strategic minds in Britain to keep Harry at arm's length, to let the Sussexes fade, to let time do what press releases could not. And instead, in what may be one of the final major decisions of his reign, Charles chose the opposite path. He chose to reach. Harry did not speak. He could not apparently. He simply looked at his aunt, then at his father, and then, for the first time in what witnesses described as a very long time, at his brother. And William looked back. Now the tabloids will tell you that William and Harry are finished, that the rift is permanent, that the wounds of Spare, of the Oprah interview, of the Netflix documentary, of every leaked briefing and counter-briefing over half a decade have hardened into something that cannot soften. And for years, that has appeared to be true. But the people in that room saw something else. They saw two brothers, both raised by the same mother, both broken by the same loss in that Paris tunnel in August 1997, look at each other across a Windsor drawing room and, for one silent second, remember who they were before any of it. That is what Charles wanted them to feel. That was the wish beneath the wish. But Anne was not finished. Because Charles's final wish, as she then explained, was not only about the brothers, it was about the monarchy itself. And here is where the room went from emotional to strategic, from personal to constitutional, in the space of a single sentence. Charles, Anne told them, wants William to be ready. Not next year, not in 5 years. Now he wants the transition, when it comes, to be seamless. He wants Kate at William's side in a formal advisory role that goes beyond the traditional expectations of a queen consort. He wants Anne herself to remain what she has always been, the workhorse of the family, the quiet spine of the institution, but with an expanded semi-official mentorship over the younger generation. And he wants, and this is the part that reportedly made even Camilla lower her eyes, a public gesture of reconciliation with Harry before the end of his reign. Not a private one, a public one. You can imagine what that meant to the room. A public reconciliation with Harry would rewrite the entire narrative of the last 5 years. It would humiliate certain courtiers who have staked their reputations on keeping the Sussexes exiled. It would rattle Camilla's own carefully constructed position. It would force William, who has been publicly cordial but privately unyielding, to open a door he has kept locked for a very long time. And it would, above all, tell the British people something they have not been told in a generation. That this family, for all its dysfunction, still believes in the one thing every monarchy ultimately depends on. Continuity. Not just of crowns and titles, but of blood. Of belonging. William, according to those who have since spoken about the atmosphere in that room, did not respond immediately. He stood at the fireplace for what one source described as an unusually long silence. Then he asked one question. A single, quiet question. When? And Charles, finally speaking for the first time in the entire meeting, answered him. Before I go. 3 words. That was all. And they landed in that room like a verdict. Harry, according to the same accounts, put his hand over his eyes. Kate reached for William's arm. Camilla did not move. Anne stepped back from the window and, in her own quiet way, closed the meeting. There was no ceremony. There was no announcement. The family simply, one by one, stood up and left. But nothing about that family has been the same since. In the days that followed, small signals began to appear. Harry stayed in Britain longer than anyone expected. A photograph, unposed, of William and Harry walking together on the grounds of Windsor was seen by staff and never released, but its existence has been confirmed by more than one source close to the household. Camilla, according to those who watch her closely, has been unusually withdrawn from public engagements, and Anne, characteristically, has said nothing at all. Which, in her language, tells you everything. The palace machine, the one that built its entire modern identity on control, is being asked to do something it does not know how to do. It is being asked to soften, to open, to forgive out loud in front of the country at the request of a king who understands that the greatest gift he can leave his sons is not a crown, or a castle, or a fortune. It is each other. Now ask yourself something. If you were Harry, a man who has spent years telling the world his family failed him, a man whose wife and children live an ocean away, a man whose grief for his mother has never fully healed, and your father, through the one aunt you have always respected, tells you he wants you home before he dies, what do you do? And if you were William, a future king who has carried the weight of duty since he was a teenager, who has watched his brother tear open family wounds in public, who has protected his own wife and children from the machinery that once broke his mother, and your father asks you, in front of everyone, to be the man who opens the door, what do you do? There is no clean answer. There is no press release that can hold what was said in that room. There is only the slow, painful, deeply human work of two brothers deciding whether the memory of the woman who raised them is stronger than the resentments they have built to survive without her. That is the wish. That is what Charles asked for. Not power, not legacy, not the polishing of his own reputation. He asked his sister to tell his sons, in language plain enough that neither of them could pretend not to understand, that he wants them to find their way back to each other before he is no longer here to watch. Think about the courage that takes. Think about a man who has been trained his entire life to conceal, to control, to keep the private, choosing, at the end, to make his most vulnerable request the center of his final chapter. Think about that for a moment. And here's the part nobody expected. Because in that same meeting, according to those familiar with what was discussed, Charles also made one more request. A smaller one. A quieter one. He asked that whatever happens next, whether reconciliation comes quickly, slowly, or not at all, the family agree to one principle, that they will not speak against one another in public again, not through friends, not through unnamed sources, not through cooperative books or documentaries or interviews, that whatever remains of their disagreements they will carry in private. As a family. As his family. That request, insiders say, was met with silence, because every single person in that room knew how difficult it would be to honor. And every single person in that room understood that Charles was asking them to do something the modern royal family has not done in nearly 40 years. To be quiet together. To hold their pain without leaking it. To let the institution breathe. Whether they can do it, whether William can restrain his loyal circle, whether Harry can restrain his advisors and collaborators in California, whether Camilla can restrain the courtiers who serve her interests, is the great open question of what comes next. And it is a question that will define this monarchy for the next 20 years. Because, make no mistake, what Charles asked for in that room is bigger than a reconciliation. It is a restoration. A restoration of the idea that this family, for all its failures, still belongs to itself, before it belongs to the press, to the public, to the machinery that has fed on its every fracture for a generation. If he succeeds, William will inherit a monarchy that has healed one of its most public wounds. If he fails, William will inherit a monarchy that entered its next reign with a brother still lost, still angry, still absent from the family photographs that history will remember. Everything depends on what happens in the months to come. Every phone call, every private meeting, every carefully managed appearance. And somewhere in California, Harry is now weighing a decision that no advisor, no wife, no publicist can make for him. And somewhere in Windsor, William is weighing a decision that no title, no protocol, no palace tradition has prepared him for. 2 brothers. 1 dying father. 1 aunt who delivered the words he could not say himself. That is where we leave them, on the edge of something that could either be the most beautiful ending this family has produced in half a century, or the last mischance before the door closes forever. If you've made it this far, hit like, because stories like this do not stay buried for long, and the next few months inside that palace are going to reveal exactly which way this family has chosen. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because there is one more person we haven't talked about yet. Someone whose role in all of this has been quietly, deliberately kept out of every headline, and whose next move may decide whether Charles's final wish becomes a legacy or a lament. Somewhere in Windsor tonight, a king is sitting by a window, watching the light drain out of the sky, and for the first time in a very long time, he is waiting not for a decision from Parliament, not for a briefing from his advisors, not for a call from a prime minister, but for a phone call from his son. Whichever son picks up first will change everything.